So there's one camera in my kit that on paper doesn't make a lot of sense. It's my only E-mount camera. It is the Sony A7sIII. So why do I still have it? Why haven't I sold it yet? I'm going to run through a bit of that thought process in this video. So I first bought this camera a few years ago when I was going to be doing a trip to the Philippines. I had the opportunity to purchase an underwater housing made for this camera in this configuration. So with the battery grip on the bottom and a lens port that was made to fit the 16-35. So it had a gear to be able to change the zoom on that lens. And also that lens port would fit a pretty wide range of lenses that I already owned. So I already still had a E to EF mount adapter in my kit. So it meant, I guess I didn't have to buy a lot of additional things. I basically just bought the camera, a battery grip, and an extra lens. That's the 16-35 f4, which I got off Marketplace, super cheap. So yeah, after doing a lot of research into what would be kind of the best SLR sized camera at the time to fill my needs, this kind of ticked a lot of boxes. And so yeah, I started using it as a travel camera and as my underwater camera. And once I got a feel for the autofocus capabilities of this camera, it became a real game changer for me. So for two of the recent short docos that I've done, and also a bunch of jobs, I've used this A7sIII in my salty underwater housing. And yeah, once I got my autofocus settings and workflow really dialed in, it's been a real game changer for me. My blue and gold documentary in particular, I wouldn't have been able to get those shots of gold fossicking in a cold, fast water mountain stream using my big red dragon housing, which is manual focus. And when I used to use that setup, I used to definitely shoot at lower stops to give me a bit more focus range to work with. Like I'd barely go under 5.6, whereas now I've got the hang of this. I've got a little 50mm 1.8 I shoot in the water with. I love shooting wide open in the water now, getting depth of field even underwater, but also for the above water, more portraity kind of shots. Love it. It's a better housing size to swim with than my big dragon housing. And yeah, it's been really good. Other things I've loved using this camera for are travel-based stuff. And also I shot a lot of the hiking scenes in my Awake short documentary with this camera. I've got the battery grip and a little vintage prime lens that I like on there. That's a Contact Zeiss 50mm, one of my personal go-tos. You know, that setup there is something that I can easily put around my neck. I just have to put a ND filter on the front here, which I have a few options for. All of my lenses have the same size front diameter, 77mm, so I can use the same filters across all of my lenses. So it hasn't bothered me too much that this doesn't have built-in NDs. I mean, no SLRs do, with the exception of the slightly bigger C70C80, but no SLRs have built-in NDs, as far as I know. I think the only loophole to that might be that some of the little Fujis do have a built-in ND, but more or less, most of the SLRs on the market don't have NDs. So that's always something you're gonna have to work around. But yeah, I mean, so with this, with that battery grip with two batteries inside, that's a lot of runtime. or when I'm doing travel based stuff. So when I'm overseas, for example, and I want to keep things even more compact, I will take that grip off, and then you're just left with this. And so, you know, that lens sticks out a little bit because it's got an adapter on there. But one thing that I have purchased is this super compact Sony 51.8. So that right there, tiny, lightweight, and yeah, just nice to shoot with for both photos and for video. You got a nice electronic viewfinder. The battery life on these is good. They don't overheat. So you can start to see that the advantages that this camera does have over a lot of its competitors, e.g. Canon, models like the first R5, very prone to overheating, terrible battery life once you go on the kind of higher spec video settings. Yeah, this here just works. 4K, 10-bit, 422, you can shoot up to 120 frames a second. It's only a really minor crop when you go into that setting and still pretty good quality. Yeah, S-Log3, so they haven't kind of held out on any of their log profiles like other camera manufacturers often do. And yeah, in preparation for this video today, I went back through and had a look at some of the specs on the tests of this camera. So for example, one I always like looking at is the Cine D lab test. The rolling shutter and dynamic range performance on this sensor, I'd say is still super competitive, even with the cameras on offer in 2025. You might get a camera now with RAW capabilities or higher resolution capabilities, for sure. But I mean, the thing is, there's a lot to be said just for really good 4K. So good rolling shutter performance, good dynamic range, you know, just those two things alone is pretty good. You shoot 4K properly. I doubt anyone is going to tell the difference comparing that footage and something that was shot in 6K, you know. So yeah, these are the kinds of things I've thought about a lot because if you follow my channel, you might have seen that I got a C80 in recent times. And so now my two cameras of choice, depending on the job, are predominantly a Canon C80 and my Red Komodo, both RF mount, both, and you know, I've been kind of doing the switch over to RF based lenses because it just makes sense for those two cameras. I'm shooting this right now on my Canon C80. And so it's why owning this is kind of a bit perplexing to me, because I've looked into things like getting one of Canon's SLRs, or maybe getting an underwater housing for my Canon C80 just to kind of consolidate and tidy up my kit. And yeah, look, the numbers don't add up. It'd cost me a fair bit of money to do the changeover with what I would get for selling this and what it would cost to set up a new SLR style camera. And it's kind of like, and for what, when you kind of compare the performance of this versus other SLRs on the market. And so, yeah, I think this camera has just kind of continued to deliver for me. And at least for now, it is a good part of my kit. And so I'll kind of tell you some of the things that I'm using this camera for in 2025. So first thing, something I've already covered, underwater work. I already have an underwater housing for this. There's not really any compact C80 housings available on the market now, unless I was to get one custom made. Shout out Dave Kelly in Newcastle. If you did want to get one custom made, he does a great job. I've already seen one that he made for my friend Matty Dunbar from Sydney. He did a great job. It's nice and compact. Salty surf housings here in Australia do have a model coming as well, and that's in their Siren range. And so they're a little bit bigger and a little bit heavier. A better water housing if you want to be able to use it for diving as well. But it's kind of not the type of housing I like to use in surf environments and for the types of shoots I do. It's pretty big and a little bit heavier than I like. Don't get me wrong, a great housing for certain things, but just not quite something where I look at it and go, oh, that would be a great upgrade for me. If you've seen my previous full video on my underwater setup, you'd recognize this thing here. So here is my underwater housing that I use for the Sony A7sIII. I've recently had that serviced by Salty Housing, so it's ready to get plenty more life out of. It works really well. That housing fits in the camera with the battery grip on it. I've got on-off controls for the camera and controls for everything I need. So, you know, I can set it up at home and then turn it on when I get to location. I have my buttons kind of preset to things I like. So, for example, I can flick between the viewfinder or the LCD screen, depending on what I'm shooting. I've got a button for turning off and on autofocus. So, for example, the way I like to shoot is I line up my subject with the little box on the screen, which I normally have in the middle at about the 3/4 mark. Basically, I point that at what I want to get in focus. And then depending on what's going to be happening next, I'll often turn the autofocus off so that it won't keep hunting. And I just know it's set at that distance. Or if there's moving things in the frame, it actually even does a pretty good job underwater of tracking it. So, you know, for example, a type of underwater shot that is really hard to get is something coming towards you. That's something that would have been so hard for me to get with my Red Dragon setup, having to manually pull focus. It might sound easier than it actually is, but just keep in mind, you're in an environment where it is quite hard to control your camera, whether that's because of bright light, the way the water's moving, you know, there's just so many variables that make it very different to standing next to the camera doing a focus pull. It's not like that at all. So it's pretty hard when you start doing things like that. Whereas autofocus, get your settings right and start to get comfortable with how it works, suddenly that stuff kind of does become pretty possible. Now, I have toyed with the idea of getting cameras like an R5 Mark II, an R3, or an R1 as an underwater setup and as something that would complement the other cameras in my kit a little bit more. And for sure, all of those could potentially be pretty good options, but I just have to weigh up the financial side of it. And, you know, at the moment, buying one of those bodies just maybe doesn't make the most financial sense for me because I wouldn't say that my underwater stuff is necessarily making me a lot of money or something that I can charge a lot extra for. For me, it's often something that I like doing and is a bit of a value add on projects, as opposed to something I'm getting hired specifically for or something that I can charge an extra certain amount of money for. It does make me money, but just maybe not enough money to spend too much on it. As anyone in this industry knows, it can be a bit of a money pit if you're not careful. And yeah, one of the things I always like to get across from these videos is just to try to always think of the business side of things. Cameras should be investments and kind of business purchases. And so, yeah, sure, if you can afford to buy a crazy underwater setup just to have fun with, go for it. But I always like to weigh things up a little bit. And so, yeah, that's the reason why I haven't, at least at this point, taken the plunge of getting a brand new camera and brand new underwater setup, because this is ticking a lot of boxes in that area. And yeah, like I said before, I can get up to 4K 120 frames a second using more or less the full sensor or very close to it. And for me, the things I'm doing, that is well and truly getting the job done. So some other things I use this camera for: concerts. So when I'm going to a concert as a punter and it's a band I really like and I just want to get some shots for myself. Something like this, the camera with just a little 50mm or a vintage lens or something like that, great little setup that can more or less fit in my pocket and get past security. I've taken the lens off before, put that in one jacket pocket, that in another, and it doesn't look like some massive professional camera. And then, yeah, gives me the option to film or take some photos. I shoot a lot of music on like a large scale level for concert films and things like that. And, you know, with that stuff, I'm using quite big cameras, but if it is just a band that I'm really into, sometimes I like taking a camera in and taking some shots, and I can just get away with it with this because it's just small enough and light enough to get in and make me not look like a pro gig photographer if I don't want to. On a similar note, this is really good for travel. So I took this all through Asia last year when me and my partner did a trip. Yeah, great for just taking around. I had this little lens and just chucked a cheap Pro Mist filter on the front and shot some fun stuff in Thailand and Korea and whatnot. Yeah, it was cool for that. The 12 megapixel RAWs are fine for me. You know, I think it's more about the sensor and the RAW file than the resolution necessarily. I'm not looking to crop extensively or blow them up. Sure, a little bit more resolution might be nice, but the thing is, it is because of that resolution that this sensor is so good. And you know, maybe at this point of the video, it's a good time just to remind you all that the A7S3 does share the same sensor as the Sony FX3 and FX6. So bit of a classic in the industry if you look at how much those cameras have been used on a wide range of productions in recent years. Very widespread use. And so that should kind of show the quality of this sensor and what it's capable of. One of the features of this sensor is the low light mode. So this in S-Log3 has two natives, 640 and 12,800. And I would say Sony's ISO 12,800 is yet to be surpassed by another camera manufacturer. Canon's has gotten very good, but this is, I think, really good. It was amazing when it first came out, and it's still amazing. I actually used this camera on a job. I had to do some gimbal shots, some walkthroughs of a corporate office here in Sydney, and shooting 50 frames. It was fairly darkly lit and not something that I would light myself because it was tracking through pretty long distance. And so I shot, even though I was shooting in the daytime, I shot that at ISO 12,800, and it just meant that I could then get my exposure by getting to a suitable aperture, which I think was like 5.6 or 8 or something like that. And, you know, which is what I wanted in that scenario. I wanted everything to be in focus. And if you looked at that footage, you would have no idea that it was shot in that higher ISO. Now, you know, that ISO isn't a miracle. You shouldn't underexpose it. And it is still possible to get noisy footage. Don't get me wrong, but it's really good. And yeah, that's one of the most impressive things of this camera and this sensor that is shared in those other really popular cameras, the FX3 and the FX6. I would say two of the most popular cameras in the industry over the last 5 years. Another thing I use this camera for, time lapses. And this is the first camera that I've been able to trust the more automatic settings on. And what I mean by that is like the shutter priority and the aperture priority for doing time lapses where the light's going to be changing. So the classic examples would be night to day and day to night. Since I've found how good that metering kind of works, I actually even use it in the daytime now. And look, years ago, shooting time lapses on SLR, I don't think you could trust those settings. They came out flickery, and yeah, I was just scared to use them because I couldn't ever clean them up properly in post. But this, I would almost say your time-lapse looks smoother using one of those settings than it does shooting straight manual. The metering is just really good. And so it balances everything out as it takes shots. And then, yeah, the result ends up being really smooth. And my chosen workflow, which look, I will say isn't perfect, but it works well for me. I'm actually shooting in JPEG and S-Log3, because then when I bring the JPEG sequence into DaVinci Resolve, it fits really well into my workflow. And my standard kind of workflow is to use the color space transform as a starting point and then do adjustments around that in my node structure. If you know, you know, color space transform works great, way better than LUTs. And yeah, it just saves me having to add another step to the process. DaVinci Resolve doesn't actually accept Sony RAWs, which is another reason why I'm doing that. And so what I would have to do is run them through Lightroom and then punch them out, which would potentially give you a better quality end result. But, you know, I just find it's good working in a setting where it's already going to match up with the video a little bit more. So using S-Log3 helps with that. Yeah, that's how I use it and continue to be pretty happy with the results. And so, yeah, I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to this camera and how it continues to work for me in 2025, and how, at least for now, it's staying in my kit, because the amount it would cost to change over to something new and improved that probably had an RF mount on it, kind of, at least at the moment, doesn't really seem worth the juggle to me when this is working so well. As you'll have seen through this video, I've shot a lot of stuff with this camera that I've been super happy with. I think it's actually grown on me a bit over the years. I think I will say the only kind of downside of this is I don't find the long GOP codecs on this as good as they are on cameras like the Canon. I think you really do have to go with that XAVCI and the higher data rates on this camera if you're going to be using it, because I have noticed banding and kind of issues with stuff shot in XAVCL, which is what I think I shot my first trip with this on, because I just had the slower SD cards. So yeah, you definitely want to go with that XAVCI and the higher data rates, which are pretty big files. And so some of the newer cameras on the market are doing way better with their long GOP and their H.265 codecs. But, you know, it is what it is. XAVCI is a industry renowned codec that is really good to edit, so nothing wrong with that. It just means the files are slightly bigger. Yeah, who's a Sony user? Who has had one of these or had one of the cameras that use this sensor? What do you think? Or are you a Canon shooter who's never used one of these? Keen to hear your thoughts. And I know everyone is kind of eagerly awaiting successors to cameras like the FX3 and FX6. And who knows if this is the year they'll drop or not, but at least for the time being, I think cameras like this still have a place in your kit. Cheers for watching.